This video is about
American history.
This short video focuses on the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates of 1858. One of the debaters was Stephen Douglas. He was a Democrat and he was the incumbent senator for Illinois. And Stephen Douglas was a superstar. He was a national figure. He was in his third consecutive term as a U.S. senator, and he'd been a major player in the Compromise of 1850. He was also the author of the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which you may remember had repealed the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Lincoln was the other candidate, and he was very much the quote-unquote other guy in this debate, and you'll hear more about that a little bit later. He was a Republican, and he'd served 2 terms in the state legislature, and he had served 1 term as a congressman. So he wasn't very well known basically outside the state, but I should say he was popular among the Republicans in the state. Lincoln was nominated by the Republican Party to run against Douglas for a Senate seat to represent the state of Illinois. When Lincoln accepted the nomination, he made a couple of very famous statements in his acceptance speech. The first was that a house divided against itself cannot stand. The house being the United States of America, and the issue that was dividing it was slavery. Lincoln said that the government could not continue half slave and half free, which, as you can see on this map, is pretty much what the United States looked like at this time, although I admit this map represents the country a couple of years after the debate. Stephen Douglas jumped on Lincoln's language and warned people that Lincoln was hoping to dissolve the Union. He attacked Lincoln as a radical. In response to Douglas's attacks and to increase his visibility nationwide, Lincoln challenged Douglas to a series of debates throughout the state of Illinois. They agreed that there would be 7 in total, and they were well-attended events. People followed them closely within the state of Illinois and across the country. And they weren't popular because of Lincoln, although he is famous to us. They were popular because of Douglas. As I said, he'd been a national political figure for 12 years, had been a major force in keeping the country together throughout the 1850s. He was a star, and people wanted to see him, and people wanted to hear him speak. The debates were covered in newspapers across the country. At one of the debates, as many as 20,000 people came to hear the 3-hour program. The most popular or most common debate topic was slavery, and the expansion of slavery into the West. This should come as no surprise to you, given the Dred Scott decision that had just come out the year before, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act was only 4 years old. Slavery and race were on every American's mind. There were 2 key pillars in Douglas's speeches during these debates. The first pillar was his, let's call them character attacks on Lincoln. From the beginning, we know that Douglas attempted to portray Lincoln as a radical. One source of Lincoln's radicalism was his saying that the Union could not survive half slave and half free. The idea here being that Lincoln would dissolve the Union rather than try to find a way to mend the growing divide in the United States, as Douglas had done in the past. Another source of Lincoln's radicalism was that, according to Douglas, Lincoln believed in racial equality, which is the eligibility of all people to live together as equals. We will see how Lincoln responds to this charge in a couple of minutes. The second pillar was Douglas's position on the expansion of slavery. We have a clear idea of Douglas's position on slavery from his authoring of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. His concept of popular sovereignty demonstrated, at worst, politically speaking, a pro-slavery stance. At best, politically, he took a preserving the Union stance, which made him willing to make concessions to pro-slavery forces. The major issue for Douglas was that the Dred Scott decision seriously undermined his theory. The ruling from the Supreme Court essentially said that neither the state nor federal governments are authorized to make any laws concerning slavery. This put Douglas in a tight spot. If he supported this ruling, he risked losing the support of Northern Democrats. If he stood up for his idea of popular sovereignty, he risked losing the support of Southern Democrats. Lincoln recognized Douglas's dilemma and forced the question on Douglas at the second debate in Freeport. Douglas decided to support the Supreme Court's ruling, but tried to find some wiggle room. He argued that if a community did not want slavery, then they could write up their police regulations to not include any laws that would protect slavery. Slave owners would become aware of the absence of these protections and decide not to move to those communities, and that would make the communities quote-unquote free. This new position became known as the Freeport Doctrine. Like Douglas, Lincoln's speeches focused on two things: defending his character against Douglas's attacks and the future of slavery in America. In his defense, Lincoln explained that he did not believe in racial equality, and to be fair, such an idea did not have a lot of support in any part of the country in the 1850s. He did believe, however, that all human beings should share in some basic rights. He argued that if African Americans could be denied basic human rights, it wouldn't be difficult for governments to enact laws that denied rights to other groups, like immigrant laborers, for example. Such a possibility convinced Lincoln of the immorality of slavery. It is important to note, however, that Lincoln was not an abolitionist. He believed, like many Americans in the North, South, and West, that the quote-unquote African American race was not prepared to live on equal terms with white Americans. What Lincoln and the Republican Party wanted was to stop the expansion of slavery. They wished to contain slavery to the states and territories in which it already existed. Lincoln had no intention of challenging slavery where it existed already. The theory was that the institution of slavery was unsustainable and that if left alone, it would eventually die out. Another argument that Lincoln made about the expansion of slavery into the territories was that free states and free territories and people who opposed slavery could not compete economically with those who used slave labor. Lincoln believed that slavery eliminated economic opportunities for other Americans. So, for 3 months, these two talented orators crisscrossed Illinois, thrilling thousands of people with their amusing stories, biting sarcasm, and intimidating wit. For Lincoln, he gained national exposure as an eloquent speaker, and Republicans started to see him as their next presidential candidate. For Douglas, the debates were a bit of a mixed bag. He won the Senate seat in 1858, but the Democratic Party was starting to split apart along sectional lines. The Freeport Doctrine was not popular among Southern Democrats, and feeling alienated by Douglas, they began to look for someone else in the Democratic Party that would support and represent their views. In a couple of years, Douglas and Lincoln will face off again, this time as opposing presidential candidates. But by 1860, Lincoln's star is very much ascendant. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said for Stephen Douglas. Thank you very much for watching. See you next time. Thank you very much for watching this video about
American history.